Lovely. Hi, everyone. I'm here to welcome Professor Mark Brown to a conversation today. Mark is Ireland's first chair in digital learning and the director of the National Institute for Digital Learning at Dublin City University. He has decades of experience in the digital learning space. Before he began his esteemed career in Dublin, he was the director of the National Centre for Teaching and Learning at Massey University in New Zealand. So we are claiming him as one of ours. Mark, you've been heavily involved across the globe in many organisations focused on digital learning, student success, and more recently, micro-credentials. So I'm hoping that you will summarise for us today the European approach to micro-credentials and really share some of the amazing projects that are being undertaken across Europe, and particularly the ETRU group of innovative universities who I know have a very bold vision for the future.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And it's nice to be introduced as a New Zealander, but someone from down under. And it's, in many respects, a privilege here living in Europe, but I still bring that down under perspective to life. And I think that's one of the enriching aspects of being in this part of the world. But to answer your question, there is a lot happening in Europe right now. I'm going to use the metaphor of a roadmap because all roads at the moment appear to be leading towards micro-credentials. Rightly or wrongly, actually, and we may get into this as, how come, but the European Commission has really been leading the charge with trying to provide a policy framework for all member countries. So something is done in a more coordinated way. And I'm sure many people will be aware that different countries around the world have been doing things with micro-credentials, but there's a lack of common understanding, lack of shared definitions even. So the significance of what's going on in Europe, I don't think can be underestimated when you have a block of countries trying to adopt what's called a European approach. That said, and I'll stop on this note for now, it's incredibly complex of what's happening. So I can explain some of the threats and why it is so complex, but it's certainly significant.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on that because when I've been investigating and researching it and reading everything that comes up around the European approach, there are just so many things going on that I really do get a little lost in which thread to go down. Where would you start?
Well, I think I'll start with the European Commission because the Commission has an interesting role in education. Mm-hmm. Each member state sets its own policy agenda, its own frameworks for education. It's responsible, each country is responsible for education. So the Commission can only nudge and set policy architecture, encourage, support with funding, and the funding's not insignificant, I should emphasize. But the Commission last year, actually really before COVID, decided that it wanted to help to produce something that would support a more European-wide approach because observers were seeing what was happening. New Zealand was well known for having started with something that was linked into the qualification framework. It often gets acknowledged for that. But the United States, similarly, more at a state level, which it's kind of a little bit like cowgirl or cowboy land with all different manner of things happening with badges and the like. So the last thing in Europe, and it's kind of around European values, that a whole of European approach. So the Commission formed a large consultation group, not huge, but certainly a wide number of stakeholders. For whatever reason, I had the privilege to be able to serve in that group. I sort of say for whatever reason, slightly tongue-in-cheek, because my own background is around providing access to education. I actually don't like to necessarily be thought of just, interested in new technology in teaching and learning. And so when I was at Massey University, New Zealand's large distance and online provider, I had responsibility for that portfolio. So I come with a long track record in trying to promote access to education and support lifelong learning. And so there isn't an accident that I'm around the table in a number of places. What happened, of course, is COVID came along. So instead of having interesting and long meetings in Brussels, where we tend to go, the base of the European Commission, we met virtually. And that was in itself quite a challenge for quite a sizable group. But we had a series of meetings to try to produce something as a European-wide approach. Of course, the very first thing we needed to do, and many people listening to this might be wondering, what the heck is a micro-credential? And that took us a number of months, in fact, almost a whole year, and I'm not sure we've fully resolved that. We have produced a draft sort of European definition of what a micro-credential is, some cornerstone principles underpinning that definition about proof of learning, the need for assessment, transparency, beyond, shall we say, warm body badges that are sometimes referred. So needing to have, we often talk about 3 C's, the currency of a micro-credential. I'll refer to a macro-credential to start with for people who are not as familiar with this area. We all understand what a degree is, a macro-credential, if you like. So we're talking about the micro version of that. It just so happens, actually, the degree, the macro-credential, is not quite as consistent as we might think it is globally. In some countries, degrees are 4 years, some they're 3, variations across disciplines. So we don't actually begin with quite the same solid foundation as we might like to think we do with macro-credentials. But nonetheless, the Commission's work to produce, in the end, published in December, quite a substantial report defining what a micro-credential is in the European context, and then producing a roadmap for how we might go forward in a common and shared way.
Wow, is all I can say. I know that was a few sentences, but that's a huge, huge body of work. Once you had that definition of the micro-credential, what was the next step?
So in many respects, we're still working on that next step.
Okay.
And there are a lot of analogies that are used around micro-credentials or metaphors. You could say we're building the plane where we're still in the air. A great comment came through from a Canadian last week, I think it was, or the week before, that micro-credentials are a bit like catnip for politicians or for perhaps university vice-chancellors or presidents. I mentioned at the start that all roads are leading to micro-credentials, but there are a fair few back roads, and some of them were broken bridges that don't connect. So right now we have a framework, shall we say, of a roadmap. What we're trying to do at the country level, at the state level, is align that into the European roadmap. And put more flesh or detail, or should we say, turn the back road into something that ultimately might become more like a highway, and we're all on the same road. So I think it's very much the case that this is it's a cliche, but it's a work in progress. And I think we are still at a very early stage. It's quite notable that only 2 weeks ago, probably even less than that, 10 days ago, the European Commission has issued a public consultation process on micro-credentials. So I think this is very encouraging, because as a policymaker, if you want a policy to be effective, if you want a policy to be owned and understood, consultation with a big C is crucial. And whilst in the European context, sometimes that can grind things down and slow things down, ultimately, if the end goal is that we want micro-credentials to be highly credible, to have currency like a degree does, to be recognized by employers, to be valued by employees, then all of this, I think, is crucial work. And in Europe, the Bologna process, which is essentially very influential in many parts of the world, including down under, because it's the process that provides mobility across qualifications, recognition of what credit value is. The aim is to have micro-credentials fit into the European qualification framework, and that in turn would align, or other countries will align with that. It's just so influential. But there are also lots of things going on, if I use the roadmap example, at the country levels, and Ireland is leading the way in many respects as well. Finland is doing quite a lot of work. And one of the challenges, because me, of course, not English speaking by first language, Italy has a huge investment in various initiatives in micro-credentialing. But here in Ireland, our government, through a digital transformation fund for teaching and learning for universities, has funded €12 million for the 7 Irish universities to work on a national micro-credential platform. So a small country like Ireland, similar to New Zealand in many ways, if you can't do it in a very small country with coherence, then I suspect it would be pretty hard elsewhere. So you have those different initiatives going on at the same time. But in micro-credentials, we must not lose sight of industry initiatives. And MOOCs are a little bit of the middleware in many respects, because the evolution of the MOOC, what we're seeing is MOOCs and micro-credentials now becoming almost synonymous. And in particular, the MOOC platforms are reaching out and partnering with industry providers and universities in some cases, but not always. Some of them are industry-led. And what I often argue here in Europe is, if all we do is take the macro credential and turn it into a micro, and there's a question is how small is small, we will have lost an opportunity to have fundamentally transformed, I'll use that word, our credentialing landscape or ecology. And what I mean by that is, we need to reach out and have more of our stakeholders, not just industry, but also community groups. There's a great example in Canada just recently of a micro-credential in well-being and workplace well-being in partnership with the university, but that's coming out of a community organisation. I'll stop on that note. There are just many things going on, and you might want to expand or ask me to elaborate on any one of those.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. You're right. There are just so many things going on, and I thank you for that overview. It's fascinating. For me, you mentioned Ireland, you mentioned Italy, you mentioned Finland. Why do you think those particular countries are sort of moving ahead with micro-credentials? What are the driving forces, do you think, that are pushing that forward?
Yeah, so I speak a lot about the drivers, because I think the drivers help us also try to figure out what the definition is and then what the end game might be. And it's a bit of a slogan, but I frequently say that micro-credentials should be in the service of big ideas. They are not the big idea themselves. And I'm even critical of my own organisation in some respects, because we've just established a new position with a responsibility for micro-credentials. I've seen this happen in Australia. There are a number of universities, leading universities, with that focus. The reason I'm critical is, should we be focusing on micro-credentials, or should we be focusing on lifelong learning being the outcome, or should it be employability or other things? So one of the challenges I think around micro-credentials is that there are different ends that people have in mind. Right now, because of COVID, and this is certainly my reading of what's happening in Australia, there is a focus on employability, upskilling, and influential agencies like the World Economic Forum, with claims that 50% of employees are going to need upskilling within the next 5 years, are certainly influential. The changing nature of work cannot be underestimated. That is real. But I think there's a lot of myth and misinformation packaged with that. We have heard for probably about 30 years now. In fact, the original source for this claim that 65% of jobs won't exist in the future has not ever been found. That is just something that's become one of these truisms that's quoted, but the research shows that there's no evidence to support that. There are many jobs that haven't actually been lost. They've morphed, they've changed, but they haven't been completely lost. Now, I wouldn't say there aren't going to be jobs. And again, AI is real. So we have a number of different drivers, one being employability, another being, in Europe, lifelong learning is actually a very important tradition. It's part of what it means to be Europe. The Scandinavian countries, hence I mentioned Finland, lead in this area. But there are other factors as well. And if we look at our education system, arguably, it's a product of the 19th century. certainly not the 20th century. And so the idea that we could somehow front load people by sending them off to kindergarten and play centres, and then they go off to school, they do their number of years, they acquire their various qualifications, and we can argue whether the way we measure and assess learners is still relevant. And then if they're lucky, they'll go off and do further education in a college, a university, a TAFE. And once they graduate from there, our idea that that's it, you've had your education for life. That was my experience. And I'm unusual because I came back as an adult, but that does not make sense. So put aside employability. If learning is life, and I repeat that, learning is life, if that's the ethos and the mindset we want to embrace, then of course we're going to want to have just enough, just in time, just in case opportunities to keep learning. So for me, this is about mindsets more than anything else.
Mark, I know that there is almost a hyper-focus in industry at the moment around the need to really reskill, upskill the current employees that are there within corporations. How do you think universities or learning institutions can work with industry in a meaningful way to actually make that happen?
Yeah, so for me, as I was saying, this is for part of what micro-credentialing is about as a movement. It's again, the narrow focus on just micro-credentialing. We want to look at, to use a bit of a cliche again in some respects, what does higher education 4.0 look like? And I mean, it's not really, because industry 4.0 is real. We do need to be a little critical of some of what we're being told, but we would be pretty naive if we didn't think that there was going to be this ongoing transformation to the nature of work through technology. And that has implications for our educational institutions. Of course, universities are not just here to produce people for jobs, but we would be pretty naive again if we didn't think that that's what many of our students are actually wanting. So in the work that we're doing, we're looking for ways that we can work with industry and not just delivering students with different skills, because another aspect that I haven't touched on is a development of more transversal future skills, soft skills. That people have different terms and they're not all necessarily the same. But that's again a recognition that knowledge by itself can become pretty redundant or obsolete quickly, and there are certain skills that are required, that the ability to work in teams, to problem solve, critically think. These are all things that employers tell us they want. I have a little bit of caution there because I'm not sure they actually always employ people with those, but nonetheless, the opportunity to work much more closely alongside industry partners in a co-construction or co-design model. The value of giving students the chance to do internships as part of their learning, as part of their degree. My own university has a very high proportion of students that's part of the ethos of the particular university, being a younger university. Those links tend to be part of what we've done from the start. But recognizing also that there are, and not just when I talk about industry, I'm not just talking about big corporates. There are different professional bodies that have their own standards, their own requirements that need to be met. So to be alongside and influencing those, because equally some of those professional standards, whether they be for lawyers or whether they be for construction workers. I actually gave a talk last week for the entertainment industry that is very interested in micro-credentialing. I'll elaborate on that shortly for why. It just shows you the different drivers. But basically being able to work alongside each other so that we're informing and learning from each other, and in the end, supporting the kind of learner that we might want going forward. But just to give you an alert of how complex it is when you start doing that alongside industry and professional bodies. Last year, our team was involved in a national survey of micro-credentialing in Ireland, which included employers and employees as well. And only half the employers had any sense of what micro-credentials are. From the employer and employee perspective, when one embarks on some professional development, in many cases that's recognized in their contract. And if they happen to acquire a macro-credential or some kind of recognition that's identified in their contract and the award that the union may have negotiated, then they might get a pay rise for that, or they may get a promotion. It's recognized, built into their professional framework. Micro-credentials, no recognition currently at all because they just don't exist. They weren't there. So in order for those to be built into, say, the contract at a national level, the unions would need to be involved in that. And those negotiations typically happen on not necessarily an annual basis, but on a 3 to 5 year time frame. So there's certainly a lag there. In Europe, one of the combined unions came out very suspiciously about micro-credentials last year in a report. Because again, macro-credentials have status, they're recognized. So micro-credentials are being seen as somewhat suspicious and even a form of de-skilling because of the fact that on-the-job training by itself wouldn't be recognized and provide the mobility that a macro-credential does. So again, there's lots under the bonnet if I want to take the roadmap analogy and then put a car there and say, we really do have to think through this very carefully.
Wow, thank you for that. And I truly had not thought about the union aspect of that. And gosh, that feeds back, doesn't it, into one of your big C's, and that's the currency for employees. If that's not there and won't be there for some considerable time, then yes, where are we going with micro-credentials and where are they going to land? Interesting stuff.
Just to come in with that entertainment or event management example, because it is a really interesting one that it made me have to think, because I come from a university perspective and I'm actually trying to almost talk about universities needing to change in the way they do things. I would say that we shouldn't expect universities necessarily to be re-engaging in new ways of credentializing when it's our very credentials that are the ones that have the elitist status. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily in the interest of universities to threaten their status with lots of these micro-credentials unless we capture that area. But the entertainment / event management talk that I was giving, they're interested because they go to set up for different gigs, and they have no control over the venue typically, but they pay a fortune for insurance. So they're scaffolders that need to put up the lights. They also typically employ a lot of casual staff or local staff. So knowing that someone has the certificate that knows how to put up the lighting, as an example, for an event, means that they can arguably reduce their insurance liability because they can show that their staff, the labour, are adequately trained to do the job. So that has nothing to do with a credential that necessarily builds into being a degree qualification, the micro stacking to the macro. And I often talk, at a definition level, seeing it on a horizontal and a vertical axis, in that some if you think stacking type micro-credentials, building up together, are more like lifelong learning stacking, but then we have life-wide learning where we're not necessarily doing things that are connected. I might be interested in keeping bees and I can do a course on bees, but similarly, I might want to learn something about cooking and I can do a class that leads me to have a micro-credential, and that's not for work purposes, but it is equally valid, you could argue, if the whole end goal is to have people who are committed to their lifelong learning and development.
Couldn't agree more. And it also leads into then the notion of where do you store those? Like, where's the container for all of those credentials? And certainly when you touched on the aspect of certification for compliance, around insurance. And I mean, that's a very big market from my perspective, and crucial. But where do you store it? I mean, I think, and I know that there are lots of people looking into this notion of a skills passport or a skills wallet. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, whilst I don't get too much under the bonnet, to use the expression I used previously around technical platforms, they do matter. And from a university perspective, I can only speak on behalf of my own university. If we understand that our credential is actually the thing that we issue that really does have value in society and the way it's regarded. So that's what universities have as their credentials. You can argue whether the curriculum is as valid or as relevant as it should be, and that will vary from one university to the next. But that piece of paper or now digital credential that's issued really is important. So if we're going to start issuing micro-credentials with our logo, letterhead on them, we do not want those to be all around the world unless we can verify them. Because we know that fraud in this area is already quite common with macro-credentials, and we have to go through, to verify those, particularly when we accept international students. So if we're going to be issuing thousands, potentially even millions of micro-credentials, somehow you've got to have a means of recognizing and verifying them. And perhaps in a way where to save the overhead costs is because otherwise you can have a very large unit in university opening emails every day asking to be verifying various qualifications, where employers and employees, citizens can go in themselves and do that. So it's basically seamless. So for that reason, yes, back-end platforms really do matter. It's quite an ironic twist in many respects, because Digitry, which I know is used in Australia and New Zealand universities, it's now the platform of choice in Canada for the universities, began many years ago at Dublin City University as a startup. And it still has its head office here in Dublin, only a stone's throw from the main campus of the university. So we have a strategic partnership with Digitry. We forged that last year. Digitry issue our macro credentials. So we're committed to working, not to suggest we're solely committing ourselves to one platform or one company, but we're committed to something that is credible, that has international mobility and scale, understanding the real challenges. In Europe, just like elsewhere, there are many different platforms emerging, many that would claim the blockchain is essential to this. I'm still not convinced right now. I sometimes say, you actually don't need a platform for a micro-credential. If all you're doing is issuing a certificate, that's a micro-credential. Of course you do if you want to scale up. But where the European Commission is really, I think, going to ultimately be incredibly influential is we have a thing called the Euro Pass. It has been around for a while, and in its Euro Pass version 1 was essentially a glorified electronic CV that you could upload, and every citizen is able to do that, fairly one-dimensional. What the Commission is doing is putting millions, if not more, into the development of the Europass as the one-stop shop platform for micro-credentialing. Well, not just for micro-credentialing, actually for your portfolio, for your profile as a citizen. Anything that you have done, you can upload into this. So whilst I don't think there will ever be a single micro-credential platform, what we're talking about here is interoperability. So anyone who has a micro-credential or a platform that's capable of issuing badges in the future will be constrained if they're not interoperable with the Europass. I'm involved in a project where we're piloting, trying to get our micro-credentials working within the Europass and bringing all the information that needs to come with that, all the metadata, the ability to look at the evidence that sits behind it. Because again, this is about what do employers really want to see? Do they just want to see the certificate, the badge, or do they want to understand what you've done? I lean towards what I'm much more interested when I'm employing someone is their trajectory. What's their kind of curve they're on? Is there real evidence that they're committed to their own development and lifelong learning? That's the kind of person we want to employ because they're going to be committed to relearning and unlearning and continuing. So I want to see that evidence, not just the badge itself.
I'm very happy to hear you bring up the word evidence. Of course, the company that I work for, that's our main focus. It's all around the evidence of learning. What does that look like? How does that align to your skills? How does that reflect your personal skills and competencies. So very nice to hear you talk about the evidence of learning as being important in this whole ecosystem. I do think, though, there's a lot of energy being placed globally around getting our language right, getting a shared language, whether that's a shared skills language, whether that's a shared language around, competencies or whatever it is. I know that there are various pockets around the world focusing on that. I would think in an attempt to sort of make a little sense out of the chaos, and try and see if we can have that eventual interoperability, not just on a structured data level, but on all levels. How much do you think that will slow things down, or is that a necessary step?
Well, again, what I want us to do with micro-credentialing is use it as a vehicle for truly transformation. And if you like, I know these are buzzwords, or I had a colleague that used to call them aerosol words. You spray them around and they sound good, but they kind of disappear. There's no substance. But disruption, here's an opportunity, a disruptive movement. You could argue that this is a once-in-generation opportunity to rethink the 19th century credentialing model that we have, which is still pretty enshrined in most countries. And so the example of the ECIU University, it's a bit of a mouthful. The ECIU stands for the European Consortium for Innovative Universities. My own university, being a younger, under 50 years of age university with kind of innovation in its DNA, has been a member for many, many years, several decades. And so there are 13 institutions, 13 universities, plus in addition to that, Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, which is a very innovative university, as an associate member. And just for your listeners, Dublin City University is Arizona State University's European partner. So we're very privileged in many respects that we're able to take advantage of and learn a lot from what is known as the US's, I think, for about the fifth year running now, in these various awards that are giving out the most innovative university in the US. And it stands for trying to do things differently in terms of university education. So there's a network here that's quite powerful. What we've received is quite a sizable amount of funding from the European Commission to develop micro-credentials, but for a whole new ecosystem for learning and higher education. But even when I use the word higher education, that suggests that it's only a small part of the ecosystem. When I was referring previously to working with industry partners, that's very much part of what we're trying to do. So we are developing micro modules that learners can share across the partner universities, whether that's part of the curriculum or the co-curriculum. It can be either or at the moment. This is still very much work in progress. We've offered up to 70 in the first iteration of these micro modules. We're planning at the moment to issue for the new academic year for us, which starts in September, a suite of really signature micro-credentials. We're calling them ECIU creds, that focus very much on the kind of high-level skills that employers tell us they want. So there'll be a select number focusing very much on transversal skills, 21st century skills. And then there will be things like data analytics or data literacy. So just like we perhaps now see digital literacy as quite important, in today's age, data literacy is very important. So that'll be one of the micro-credentials. And the advantage for us as a consortium is that we can pool our expertise, our innovation. We may not have the same capacity in just one partner university or one university to do a particular knowledge area or domain. By partnering, we managed to harness the expertise that exists across the partners. Ultimately, though, all with a view to give learners a much more enriched and transformative learning experience. So that's a very exciting project, and it gives not only an insight into perhaps a different model, a different type of ecosystem, but first-hand experience on how challenging it is. It's hard to get two universities truly working and collaborating. Getting this group And we're talking here also where, in many respects, in Ireland, we're fortunate because you could say that we're Europe's now only English-speaking country as first language. But we're talking across multiple languages. Interestingly, supporting multiple languages is also part of what we're trying to do, being multilingual with micro-credentials, that the skilled employee of the future, if you really want to future-proof your career, you need to be multilingual. This is something very foreign for many of us down under, particularly if we haven't had a European background in the way we were settled. So, and that's really fundamentally about what it means to be European, to be multilingual, to be have mobility across borders, to be multilingual. Another one of our micro-credentials is going to be on active citizenship. Which is perhaps linked into intercultural awareness, but understanding what it means to be a citizen and an active contributing member of society. And so that's more true to, shall we say, the principles of a university in a truer sense, but at the same time, things like data literacy and other really cutting edge areas like the Internet of Things, where there is clear skill shortages. That's the focus of what we'll be doing in that consortium.
Brilliant. Well, it sounds like a model that A, should be watched carefully, but B, would be wonderful to attempt to replicate in other areas of the globe. However, I think your statement earlier it's probably leads to why it's happening in Europe and not in other places. It's that ethos of education as a public good, and that, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are many good things about working in this part of the world. There are elements where perhaps we could be more business-like, not a business, but business-like processes. But on the other hand, the reason we've got 12, 13 universities sharing and willing to share and collaborate at a deep level is because we're not seeing ourselves as competing with each other in the same way as we might in a smaller ecosystem, smaller fishbowl in some respects, not trying to be disrespectful, but it is most definitely a different ethos and a different role that universities in particular play. European universities are actually quite small in comparison to Australian universities in particular. The idea that you could have a university with 90,000 students is mind-boggling in this part of the world. But they're unique. They add their own flavor within that ecosystem. They have a niche, if you like, habitat within the wider ecosystem. And diversity and richness comes from that. So we're better for that variety. And if you think even the ecosystem analogy or metaphor is quite a good one in many respects, because the future of any species, plant or animal, depends on its adaptability as the environment changes. So the more diverse the environment, the more arguably you are ready to adapt. You're being prepared to adapt. It's the very reason my own university, that ecosystem sort of metaphor I've given you, why my own university chose to get into MOOCs, because we wanted to position ourselves, not to showcase our wares on the global stage, but to learn how we could do things differently in a different sandbox. To position us for what's coming. And COVID, I think, showed that those institutions that had made an investment in new models, particularly digital infrastructure and different ways of doing things, were far better positioned. In our case, it was not a difficult pivot, not to underestimate how challenging it was, but that advanced work we had done really positioned us.
Yeah, I think the work that universities who had started that transformation process prior to COVID are the ones that are frankly going to survive in a post-COVID world. Couldn't agree more. Mark Brown, as usual, has been an absolute delight to talk with you. I thank you so much for your words of wisdom. I thank you for sharing your thoughts and views on the European approach to micro-credentials. And I wish you all the best with your myriad of projects that you have your fingers in. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And just to make sure that I'm only one of many people that are working in this space, and we all need to join up to in activities and opportunities like this to share our thinking and learn what works. and what doesn't work. So I'm very interested to see what's happening in Australia in particular, because there is certainly momentum in this area. It's just how we scale that up is one of the large challenges we all face.